Okay. So today we're getting started with factor markets. Factor markets are different than product markets, where product market is what we have been focusing on so far. With anything that we have really talked about so far, we have mostly just focused on product markets. Okay, so I'll make sure I'm going to take you through the differences between factor markets and product markets and how they're different than each other. Just to let you know, factor markets will also be sometimes known as resource markets or input markets. So factors, right, are basically inputs that we use to make stuff. Okay, so outputs are the goods and services. Inputs are what we use to make those goods and services. We also call them as factors or resources. Okay. Product market. So what's the difference between product market and factor market? So product market is where households buy goods and services that are produced and sold by firms. Okay. So here, households are the buyers of goods and services. So any kind of goods and services you can imagine, like, a pen, a computer, an apple, a pizza, anything that we households buy, any goods or services that we buy to consume. We are on the households, right? The consumers. We are on the demand side because we're the ones demanding the goods and services. So households in product markets, households are on the demand side. Okay, and farms are the sellers, so they are on the supply side, so they're the one making these products and goods and services available to us for sale. So they're on the supply side of the market. Okay, that are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's talk about how resource market or factor markets are different. So factor markets is where households are the ones that provide farms, right? So that right away tells you, if you provide something, you're the supplier. So in this case, households are no longer on the demand side of the market, they're on the supply side. So what is it that they are supplying? They're supplying factors of production, right? So inputs, which are land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. So we'll see this on the next slide in more detail. But so households own, all of the resources here, like all of the factors of production, are owned by household at one way or another. Okay, so the households are the one providing these factors of production to farms for sale. So households will sell these factors of production to farms or businesses, who will then use these factors of production, these inputs, to make the goods and services, right, that we then buy in the product market. Okay, so as you can tell right away, these two markets are very interconnected with each other. They're not like, it's not that, the product market is separate, that the factor market is separate. In order for farms to be able to make products, they need to be able to buy these factors of production, these inputs, and they're going to do that in the factor market. So this is why it's kind of crucial that we understand how the factor markets work, how prices work for factors, how prices are determined, how do supply and demand look like in factor markets. So this is why we're getting into the detail of the factor markets, which is something that we have basically ignored so far. Okay, so in resource market, households are the sellers because they're selling factors of production, and farms are the buyers because they're buying these factors of production. Okay,
Mhm.
factors of production. What are these factors of production? Like I said, labor, land, capital, entrepreneurship. Labor, it's workers. can be physical labor or mental labor. Physical labor would be somebody, who does a lot of physical work, you know, construction workers, other kind of day laborers. Also, it could be mental labor, such as somebody who's teaching, somebody, like a doctor or a surgeon. They don't have to do a lot of physical labor, but they have to do a lot of mental labor. Land would be anything like natural resources, water, mineral, wood, timber, any natural resource that we can use to make goods and services. Capital, remember, there were tools, machines, buildings, things that have been manufactured that we can then use to make goods and services. Okay, so manufactured goods. Entrepreneurship is basically somebody who combines these three factors of production, and they either modify something or they make something new. So an entrepreneur will assume risk for businesses, and they will, it's these things by themselves don't do anything. Somebody has to come in, and they have to combine all these things to make goods and services. Okay. And of course, farms don't obtain these factors of production from households for free. They actually have to pay a price to hire each one of these factors. And we call them the payments that they have to make, the price that they have to pay to hire factors is called factor payments. Okay, the factor payment is for labor is known as wages. Okay, so this is the price for labor. And factor payment for land, so if somebody owns a piece of land, and you um, give it to a business to use, right, to make their goods and services, maybe they're going to build a factory over there or something, so that would be rent. Okay, for capital, if you own pieces of machinery and you rent that to businesses, you would get interest, right? The factor of payment would be interest. Okay, and these factor prices are determined by the market demand and the market supply of resources, just like in product market. Okay, price and quantity, so the supply and demand, right, these two forces, right, where they intersect with each other, right, this is where the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity is determined. Much the same way, this is determined in the product market. And what is we will see, it looks mostly similar, but a little bit different, in the product market and this is the labor market. Okay, so we'll come back to this graph. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the circular flow model. Okay, we talked about this way in the beginning when we started microeconomics. We were trying to understand how modeling works in economics, and I briefly talked to you guys about the circular flow model. So the circular flow model has two different entities, as you call them. So that there are farms or businesses, and then there are households. There are other entities as well, but for the sake of simplicity, we just limit it to these. So there is government, there is the rest of the world. We just don't bring them in, because it makes things more complicated than we want to be. We start out simple, and then we usually add complicated stuff. But for the purposes of this class, this is as complicated as this is gonna get. Okay, so farms, households are the two entities in the circular flow model. And basically what the circular flow model shows us is how inputs and outputs flow in the economy, and also how money flows in the economy. So there, as you see, there are two different sets of arrows. There are one set of arrows that are dashed. So that the dashed arrows show how inputs and outputs travel from one market to another, and one entity to another in the economy. And then the dashed arrow shows how money travels or money flows in the economy. Okay. And you have the product market and also the factor market. Those are the two different markets, and they're uh, you know you definitely need both of them for the market to function. For the economy to function, you need both of these things to work. So let's take a look at what happens and at each of these markets, and what are the roles played by farms and households. Okay, so if we start with the flow of inputs and outputs, okay, so I'm gonna start with farms over here. Okay, so farms sell, right, goods and services to households in the product market. Farms sell, households buy. Households buy the goods and services that are produced by the farms. Okay? Buying and selling both happen. Buying and selling of products, goods and services happen in the product market. Farms sell, households buy. Okay? In the product market. In the factor market, okay, households are the one that are doing the selling. And what are they selling? They are selling these factors of production: labor, land, and capital. So they're selling them in the factor market. And farms are using these factors of production: labor, land, and capital, to then make the goods and services and sell them in the product market. So it's one loop, right? It goes from farms to in the product market to the household, and then factor market, and then comes back to the farm, using these factors of production to produce goods and services that are they going to sell in the product market. Okay,
Yeah.
Sandra?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other component of this is how the money flows in the economy. So let's say if we start with the flow of dollars, and we're gonna start at it from the farm's perspective again. So when farms obtained these factors of production: labor, land, and capital, right, from the households, they had to basically buy these factors of production. They didn't get them for free, so they had to make payments to the households in the factor market. So farms had to pay wages for labor, they had to pay rent for land, and they had to basically capital, right? They had to pay interest for using capital, and they had to make these payments to the households. And these payments, okay, these factor payments that the farms made to the households, they are the income of households, right? For somebody who is selling their labor, right, they earn wages and that's their income. For somebody who has a piece of land to rent, they will get some sort of rent, right? So that's their income. So whatever factor of payments that you provide, you get an income. As a household, you'll get an income in return. Households will then spend these incomes, right? They will spend this income in the product market to buy those goods and services. And who sold those products to the households? It was the farms. And what farms are going to get in return for selling these products to the households are what called revenue for the farms. Okay, so it's, as you can see, the inputs and outputs, they're flowing in one direction. The money is flowing in another direction, but they're all sort of interconnected with each other. You wouldn't have one without the other. So farms would not be able to produce anything in the product market if households were not selling things in the factor market. And households would not sell anything if they were not getting paid for their factors of production. Okay.
Mhm.
So now, even though we have talked about four different factors of production, what we're going to start with is focusing on the labor market exclusively. And this is also how it is structured on the AP exam. Um, they mostly focus on the labor market. So we're going to start with the labor market, right? We whatever analysis that we do for labor market also can be applied to the capital market and also the land market. I think if we will have time, we'll come back to that. But if not, we'll focus mostly on the labor market, and we start talking about the perfectly competitive labor market. So we will also see imperfect competition in labor market, but we're starting with the perfectly competitive labor market. So this should already sound familiar to you, because we also learned about perfectly competitive product market. So perfect competition, when we talked about that, that was with product market and how perfect competition looked, right? So here we're talking about the perfect competition in the labor market. So what are some of the assumptions that we make about the perfectly competitive labor market? So first of all, the first assumption is that there are many small farms in perfectly competitive labor markets, and they're hiring many, many workers that have identical skills and abilities. Okay, so many small farms, and they hire many, many workers who have identical skills and abilities. And because the farms are so small, no one farm is really large enough to have any influence on the market. So they don't really have any sort of market power. And the wage, which is what is wage, why we're talking about wage is the price of labor. So farms have to pay a price in order to hire workers, right? So that price, right, to hire workers, to hire laborers, is the wage, and the wage is constant. Okay, and it is determined by the market demand and market supply of labor. So just like we talked about, how we saw in perfect competition in the product market, the supply and demand, right, the intersection of supply and demand gave us equilibrium wage, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And this P star, right? This was determined by the market, and if this is the market, we saw that with farms, they had to take this market price as sort of given. Okay, so this was the margin. This was their demand, and this was their marginal revenue. This is P and Q. So this is on the farm side. This is the market graph. This is the farm graph with perfectly competitive product market. So there is a similar idea here in the perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so the wage. Okay, so in perfectly competitive labor market, the let's see, labor market, the graph looks similar, but with some differences. Okay, so once again, the vertical axis measures price of labor, which is wage. Horizontal axis measures quantity of labor. Okay, and supply of labor and demand of labor intersects to give us an equilibrium wage rate, W star and L star. Okay, so what we see here is that the wage is constant. So it's determined by the market demand and market supply of labor. So this is the market side. When we examine the farm a little bit later, in a few more slides, we will see that they have something similar going on as we saw with the perfectly competitive product market. So it's just gonna there is a little bit of tiny bit of difference, but there is gonna be something similar that comes from having this wage rate determined by the market. Individual farms in perfectly competitive labor markets are known as wage takers. What that really means is that they can hire as many workers as they want at the wage set by the industry. Okay, so for farms, as you can imagine, wages, right? Their cost for them. So what I can tell you right now is that if this is cost for them, wages means, like if you have to pay someone, it's a cost. So it's not going to be about the demand side, but it's going to be about the supply. So the supply for perfectly competitive farms, for perfectly competitive labor markets, the supply um, is constant. So this is wage. So the W star is a constant. Okay, because they just have to accept this market price as given, and they can hire as many workers as they can at this market wage, and they wouldn't have to increase their wage, and they wouldn't lower their wage either, because if they lowered wage, workers can just go to some other farms who are going to be paying them at least this much. Okay, is this making sense to you, Sandra? Or is there something that you're not quite understanding, not being able to grasp?
No, yes.
Okay, so they're very similar to the perfectly competitive product market. The labor market and the product market, they have similarities, but there are differences in the sense that, and the most important difference comes from the fact that here this was the demand curve, right, which was perfectly elastic. Here this is going to be the supply curve, which is perfectly elastic, because it's the suppliers, right, are now the households. Okay, but the farms are now on the demand side. So the suppliers, right, the households, they have to accept this market price as given. So this is just what I showed you on the earlier slide, just a side by side comparison of the perfectly competitive product market and the perfectly competitive factor market. Okay, the product market has price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and P star and Q star, the equilibrium price and quantity. And for the factor market, or labor market, because we're really focusing on labor. Okay, we have the supply, the demand for labor, the supply of labor, wage, which is the price of labor on the vertical axis, and quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. And the intersection of supply and demand gives us an equilibrium wage rate and an equilibrium like labor quantity. Okay, so what exactly do we mean by the demand for labor, right? So we understand demand and supply when it comes to product market, but what is it that we what do we mean by demand for labor? So demand for labor basically is just means that what are the different quantities of workers that businesses are going to be willing and able to hire at different wages. Okay, and if this is price and this is quantity, if you want to make it synonymous to the product market. So the price of labor is wage, the quantity of labor is just the quantity of labor. So always remember that the wage is the uh, always going to be on the vertical axis, okay, which is the price of labor. So as you can see, the demand for labor is basically inversely related to the price of labor or wage. At higher wages, at W1, the quantity demanded, the labor that you demand, is at L1. Okay, so it's at higher wages, at wage increases, you demand less workers. At lower wages, okay, as wage goes down, you demand more workers. And the inverse is true too, right? As wage goes up, you decrease your demand. As wage goes down, you increase your quantity demanded for labor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then we talk about something known as the marginal revenue product of labor, because basically a farm's demand for labor is really based on this concept, which is the marginal revenue product of labor. So let's take a look at what this is. So the marginal revenue product of labor, we need to know about this because in order to decide how many workers you're gonna hire for your business, like how many workers you need to hire, you're basically gonna need to know, right? You're gonna have to compare the benefit, the value of hiring an additional worker to the cost of hiring an additional worker. So you need to make some sort of comparison, like how much value this worker is adding to my farm, and versus how much is it going to cost me to hire that extra person. So the way we find out how much a worker is worth to an employer, the value of an additional worker, that is basically the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay. So the technical definition is the marginal revenue product of labor is the addition to a farm's revenue when they hire an additional worker. Okay. So how much total revenue changes, okay, for a farm when they hire an additional worker. So the shorthand for marginal revenue product of labor is just MRPL, and it goes something like this: the change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. Okay, so if I hire one additional person, okay, how much does that change my total revenue? Okay, does that make sense to you, Sandra?
Mhm.
So that is basically just that is the definition. And then if we manipulate this formula a little bit to do this, I am going to divide by delta Q and then multiply by delta Q, numerator and denominator. They basically cancel each other out. So I still have the same thing, same terms that I started with before, right? But now I have introduced some things, some terminologies that I am familiar with, that I know. Okay. The change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, we know what this is. And we also know what the change in quantity divided by the change in labor is. We have seen both of these terms before. You may not remember them, but we have. So this is basically the first portion, is basically telling you how much does my total revenue change when I sell one more unit of output. Okay. And do you remember at all what that was? If I
Mm,
sell one more unit of something, how much does my total revenue change? So that is basically what we know as marginal revenue. Okay. And this portion right here, the change in Q divided by the change in L. So the change in Q is basically, you can think of it as output. So how much does my output, or total product, something like that. Both mean the same thing. So how much does my total product change when I hire one more worker? Okay. And the term for this was MPL, the marginal product of labor. The marginal product of labor is just this thing, okay, which is how much does my total product change when I hire an additional worker. Okay, so together what we find is that the MRPL is just a product of these two things, which is marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. And this is going to come in handy later. Okay. So let's take a look at why this is important. So here we have so this is a marginal revenue product of labor. And we're going to assume that, we're talking about a bakery here, and they produce loaves of bread. Each worker, they're producing loaves of bread. So this bakery, right, they can hire anywhere from 0 to 6 workers. Okay. And this column right here is the total product, which is basically showing you that when you hire, when you don't have any workers, the total product is 0. When you hire the first worker, the total output, the total output for the bakery is 6 loaves of bread. Two workers together, they can produce 11 loaves of bread. Three workers together can produce 15 loaves of bread, and on like that. And then we have in this column the marginal product, which is, basically the change in quantity divided by the change in labor. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, so marginal product of labor is basically the change in quantity divided by the change in labor. And if it helps you to think about it another way, it's the change in total product divided by the change in labor. Okay, so the way we calculate this is basically, you know what is, so if I want to calculate the marginal product of labor for the first worker, I'm basically going to have to do this, right? What is the change in total product when I hired that first worker? So the first worker, the total product for him, he produced six total products, right? Six loaves of bread. The worker before him, right, when there were zero workers, basically there were no loaves of bread that were produced. So 6 minus 0, which is the change in total product. So here we're still looking at the first worker. And then change in labor is just 1 minus 0, which is 1, right? So 6 minus 0 divided by 1 is 6. So the marginal product of labor for the first worker then is 6. And we would do the same thing for the other ones, right? So do you understand how I got these numbers 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1?
Mm-hmm.
So for the second worker, I do the same thing, except, it would be 11 minus 6 divided by 1 minus 0, because that would give me 5 and 4 and on and on. And then this column right here is showing us the marginal revenue. Okay. So what you need to understand about this, the reason marginal revenue is a constant number and we're saying that it's equal to price is because we're assuming that we're in a perfectly competitive labor market, but we're also assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive product market. We're assuming both of these things. So what that really means for us is, if in perfectly competitive product market, remember I showed you this graph. So the perfectly competitive product market, what does that show us, right? The price is determined at the market, and farms are price takers. They have to accept this market price as given, and this is their demand curve, which is perfectly elastic, and their price P star, right, this line, which is constant, fixed rate, right, fixed price, their marginal revenue is equal to their price. Remember this, Sandra?
Mm-hmm.
For perfect competition, marginal revenue is equal to price, because why does that happen is because the price is fixed. So every time they sell one more unit of output, each time they're only going to be bringing additional revenue that is equal to the price. They sell one more, the additional revenue is going to be equal to the price. Okay?
I can't hear you.
No? What about now?
Oh, okay.
Okay. So this is the reason. So we're assuming that, we're in a perfectly competitive labor market, but we're also in a perfectly competitive product market. So the product, right, the loaf of bread that the bakery is selling,
Mm-hmm.
the marginal revenue from selling each loaf of bread is going to be equal to the price. Okay. So this is why marginal revenue is equal to price. And because price is fixed for a perfectly competitive product market, the marginal revenue is the same as price, and it's the same for for every unit of labor. Okay, it's the sorry not every unit of labor. So the marginal revenue uh, is equal to price, because we're assuming we're in a perfectly competitive product market. So regardless of, if you sell, one unit, one loaf of bread, you're gonna make two. If you make another if you sell another loaf of bread, you're going to be making $2. So that's why MR is equal to P. With me,
Okay.
Sandra?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the fourth column. And then the fifth column is what we're interested in, which is the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL. Okay, so MRPL, okay, remember it's marginal product of labor times marginal revenue, right? So it was marginal revenue times MPL, like we just saw here.
Mm-hmm.
And then because I said that price is equal to marginal revenue, because we assume perfectly competitive product market. So that's why I could rewrite this as MPL times P. I don't have to. I could have left this as MPL times MR, but you could do both. It's okay. It's good for us to know both. Okay, sometimes they might not. If you know that we're in a perfectly competitive product market, you're gonna know this, but just to make sure that sometimes you might see MPL times P written, sometimes you can see MPL times MR written, but they mean the same thing. Okay, so what this number basically, the way we got these numbers is by multiplying the marginal product of labor by the price, right? So if every time 6 times 2 is 12, that was for the first unit of labor. For the second unit of labor, it's 5 times 2 or 10. For the third unit of labor, it's 4 times 2 or 8, right? So this is how we got these numbers. And what do these numbers basically tell us? Okay, so what this is saying is that for the first worker, okay, the maximum amount that farms would be willing to pay to hire that first worker is $12, because this is what the marginal revenue product of labor for that first worker is. So he is adding 12 additional dollars to the farm's total revenue. Okay, the first worker adds $12, 12 additional dollars of revenue to the farm. Okay, so that's why they would be willing to pay up to $12 to hire that first worker, but nothing more. Okay, they would be happy to pay less, but the maximum they would be willing to pay to hire that first worker is $12. Okay, so this is what we have here. So if I were to plot this marginal revenue product of labor here, this column, I have plotted this. Okay, so wage is on the vertical axis, quantity of labor is on the horizontal, and if I plot these points on the graph, I get something that looks like this uh, a downward sloping line, which is, as we will see, is also the demand for labor. So this is why I have written here that demand for labor is equal to MRPL, which is what we're trying to establish here, basically, because, and this is only because, right, because that farms care about, right, they will hire workers, or they would be willing to pay a worker the maximum amount that they would be willing to pay to hire a worker is how much they are adding to the farm's total revenue. So the first worker, it was 12. So this is for the first worker, the maximum amount of wage that they can expect to get is 12. For the second worker, okay, um, the marginal product revenue product of labor is $10. So this is the maximum amount that the farm would be willing to pay, which is the wage that they would be willing to pay to hire that second worker, because this is $10 is what this second worker is adding to the farm's total revenue. Okay, and on like this. So 12 for the second worker, it's $10. Okay, $8 for the third workers, and on like that. And the reason that the marginal product revenue product of labor, we see that it's declining, right, which basically is why the demand, the MRPL is downward sloping, and that happens because the marginal product is going down, right? Marginal product, as you see, for the first worker, the marginal product was 6. For the second, it was 5. For the third, it was 4. So it's going down, and that happens because of something we covered earlier, the diminishing marginal returns to labor. Okay, so when that happens, and we see that this is the same graph that we had when we talked about what demand for labor means, right? So this was W, this was quantity of labor. At higher wages, you want to hire up here. At lower wages, you want to hire more workers. So the point of this, of talking about this marginal revenue product of labor, is to establish that demand is similar, is synonymous to this marginal revenue product of labor. So demand for labor is the same thing as the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the marginal revenue product of labor, right, is basically the maximum amount of the maximum price, basically, that the farm would be willing to pay to hire each additional worker, because they care about what kind of value you are bringing to the farm. So if the first worker, his marginal product is 6, so he can add 6 loaves of bread per hour to the total product, and we can sell each loaf of bread for 2. So basically, the revenue that we can earn from the first worker, the value of the first worker is basically 6 times 2, or 12. Okay, so this is why the MRPL is equal to the wage rate, and we can write it as this and show that the demand for labor is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand this, or do you have anything that you didn't really understand?
No, it's okay.
Okay. All right, great. So this is all for today. When we come back on Tuesday, we don't have class on Thursday, so when we come back on Tuesday, we'll talk about the supply side. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.